but the context in which it occurs shows that if what he was claiming about himself is true, then a resurrection would be normal. The minimal facts approach that Gary Habermas takes is a little bit different than the one that I take. But a lot of historians follow this kind of thinking because there are a lot of things that, before I get into the facts, I just want to clarify. There are a lot of things that historians don't agree on, and what some acknowledge as facts, others won't. So a number will say, the empty tomb is a fact. Others will say, no, it's not a fact. Since historians disagree on so much, Paula Fredrickson at Boston University, who is a Jewish historian of Jesus, she's not a Christian, and she refers to some facts as historical bedrock. These would be kind of the minimal facts that Gary refers to. Historical bedrock, facts past doubting. And the whole idea behind historical bedrock is these are the facts upon which you want to build your hypothesis. And if a hypothesis cannot accommodate those facts, then that hypothesis needs to be revised or jettisoned. So what constitutes these historical bedrock? Well, they've got to be strongly supported by the data, and that's the most important thing. But since historians do not agree on all facts, then not only must they be supported strongly by the data, but you've got to have a very strong majority of historians who grant them as facts. And in that case, then they become a minimal fact or historical bedrock, whatever you would call it. So related to Jesus' resurrection, you would have things such as Jesus' death by crucifixion, that shortly thereafter, a number of his followers had experiences they interpreted as appearances of the risen Jesus to them. Now, that's virtually 100% of historians. A heterogeneous consensus of historians will grant those. Probably about 80%, maybe a little bit better, will grant that some of these experiences occurred to group settings. And then about 100% again will grant that a skeptic, a persecutor of the church named Paul, had an experience that he likewise interpreted as an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. And it radically transformed his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. So those would be facts that are granted by nearly all, except that one about the group appearances, and that enjoys about an 80% consensus.
Yeah, so I think I would be happy to grant the minimal facts, to grant at least almost all of them that, I think Jesus obviously died by crucifixion. I think that years after his death, many of his disciples believed themselves to have had group appearances. So the story in Paul about appearing to the 500 isn't just made up. I think that Bart Ehrman's hypothesis, where he suggests that there could have been stories that grew over time, such that there are often stories where people misremember things years down the line. Where he has a blog post where he gives the example of, you have this big, if you ask people if they saw some famous event of some plane hitting some building in the Netherlands or something, lots of people say they can remember when they saw it. Well, there was no recording of it. It never saw it. But people can develop these incorrect group memories. So I think it's possible that it sort of grew over time and grew grander. But so I guess, I'll just lay out sort of my basic objection to the minimal facts approach, and then you can sort of describe where you think I go wrong. So I agree. I think anybody is going to have to think that any non-Christian is going to have to think something kind of weird happened in first century Roman Palestine. This charismatic leader, Jesus, lots of people who didn't seem to be crazy. He, went to his death, and then a lot of people said that they saw him after his death. I'm not so sold on the empty tomb, but it's at least there's the evidence for the empty tomb is good enough that it's at least suspicious. Where you have to think something weird happened, where for some reason, in their earliest reports in Mark, they said that it was women who saw the tomb, which is a little weird. That's not what you'd expect. So I think everyone's going to have to think that something kind of strange happened. And then Paul and James and so on converted, which isn't what you would expect. But my view is, I think that while a naturalist will have to think something weird happened, I think that so will a Christian, where just the Christian hypothesis is not a much better explanation, given that even if you're like to believe it, you have to first think that God exists. You have to also think that God is sort of in the business of carrying out miracles. Then you have to think that he would want to carry out a miracle in first century Roman Palestine, and that he is sort of this Trinity who would send his son, and then would resurrect his son.
All right, hang on a second, Matthew. I mean, you're throwing a lot down right now.
Yeah.
Okay, I disagree that you have to believe all those things. First of all, you don't have to believe there's a Trinity. That is a theological doctrine. It's not a historical one. In other words, there's no way that you could prove that there's a Trinity. We can say that the early Christians may have believed a Trinity, but you don't have to believe in a Trinity in order to get to the resurrection of Jesus any more than you have to believe that his death atones for sin in order to believe that he died by crucifixion. You don't have to believe God exists in order to acknowledge that Jesus rose from the dead. So here's an example I gave in a debate with Ehrman a couple of years ago. I'll present it before you. So let's say that astronomers have been tracking a comet now for a few years, and they know that it's going to hit the moon on a certain day and time. And when that day arrives, then you have the Hubble Space Telescope that's positioned to really zoom in on the moon's surface and a few planetariums around the globe. And at the appointed time, the comet slams into the moon's surface. And as the lunar dust settles, there's a message written on the moon's surface, and it says, "Jesus is Lord," and it's written in Hebrew and in Greek. Now, here's what a good scientist would do. The good scientist, an astronomer, would say, "Wow, that's an extraordinary event to say the least. I have no plausible natural explanation for it. It certainly would seem to require a miracle or God. But as a scientist, I don't have the tools to be able to detect God. And so all I'm going to do, I can affirm the occurrence of the event, but I'm just going to have to leave the cause of the event undetermined, because the evidence for the event itself, whether the scientists believed in God ahead of time, the evidence for the event itself would be sufficient to establish that it occurred. You just couldn't be able to, as a scientist, having the tools of science, to be able to affirm that God did it." Now, here's what a poor astronomer would do. A poor scientist would say, "Well, that's an extraordinary event, and I certainly don't have any plausible natural explanations for it. It would seem to require God or a supernatural cause of some sort, but unfortunately, as a scientist, I don't have the tools necessary in order to say that God did it, and so I'm just not even going to affirm that the event itself occurred." Now, of course, that would be lunacy, but that is exactly the position that a number of New Testament critical, skeptical New Testament scholars take. And so, no, I don't think you have to be able to believe that God exists to affirm the resurrection. You can affirm that the event itself occurred, and then just leave the cause of the event undetermined. Now, maybe you'd say, well, God would be the best cause of the resurrection if it actually occurred. I agree. But that's something that you would determine after deciding that Jesus rose from the dead based on the data. So the question is, are the data strong enough to show that Jesus probably rose from the dead, or that it's the best explanation of the data?
Yeah. Well, but when evaluating whether some hypothesis is the best explanation of the data, you'll look at the probability of that hypothesis. So, you can come up with all sorts of theories that would predict the evidence of the resurrection that are just not at all believable, involving strange supernatural forces. But those aren't a good theory, because you don't have a reason to think that a being like that would want to resurrect Jesus in particular. Now, if you have the broadly Christian story, then you have a theory of why God would resurrect Jesus. And so I agree with you that if the evidence were as good as for, like, we see with the comet and it hits it and the moon and the dust settles and it says Jesus is Lord, because that would be so surprising. So, I mean, they should affirm that it happened just because they observed that it happened. And then they should say, what's the best explanation of that? Well, the Christians have a good explanation of that. That's much better than the other theories. So I think they should think, okay, probably that'll at least be very strong evidence for Christianity. Maybe it's not, I think at that point that would be enough to make Christianity probably the right view. And so I think in a similar way here, you should think that there's good historical evidence that is well explained by the resurrection. But then the question is, if you think that resurrections are inherently improbable, this is not to say they're impossible or that, we should be methodological naturalists. I don't think any of that. But if you just think, resurrections in general don't happen, especially to think that a resurrection like this happens, you have to believe a lot of stuff that's pretty improbable. Then you should think that various naturalistic explanations, even if they're not great explanations and require sort of jumping through a lot of hoops, are better explanations than that there was a resurrection.
Okay, so let me ask you this, Matthew. Why do you think a resurrection is improbable?
Well, I think so resurrections are improbable in normal cases, just because we know that most people don't resurrect. The reason I think that a resurrection, in the case of Jesus specifically, where, he's a special case, where, like, if anyone's going to be resurrected, like, if I know that some resurrections have happened, okay, Jesus is by far the best candidate for being resurrected.
And why would you say that?
Well, the reason I say that is because there's much better evidence that he was resurrected than that anyone else in history was resurrected.
Okay. I would also add the context in which it happened. So virtually all historians of Jesus, no matter how skeptical, acknowledge that Jesus came on the scene claiming to have a special relationship with God who had chosen him to usher in his kingdom, that he taught in parables, that he performed deeds that astonished crowds and that both he and his followers considered to be divine miracles and exorcisms, that he was crucified on the orders of Pontius Pilate at the instigation of the Jewish leadership, and that shortly thereafter, a number of his followers had experiences they interpreted as appearances of the risen Jesus. So he comes on the scene, and what we know about him that's agreed upon by virtually every scholar, historian of Jesus, again, it's not to say that it's true because scholars acknowledge it. I'm saying that the data is so strong that they're willing to acknowledge it across theological, philosophical spectrums. So it creates a context that's charged with religious significance, in which if these things about Jesus are true about some of his claims, then a resurrection wouldn't seem out of place.
Yeah.
Well, so not only the evidence is better than it is for others, but the context in which it occurs shows that if what he was claiming about himself is true, then a resurrection would be normal.